For many long years, the islands we now know as Indonesia were under Dutch rule. This period was called the Dutch East Indies. The local people experienced much hardship and control from their European colonizers. Resources from these rich islands were taken to benefit the Netherlands. Many Indonesians wished for a day when they could rule themselves. They dreamed of freedom from foreign powers. This desire for independence grew stronger over many decades. The Dutch administration was deeply embedded in the lives of the people, controlling trade, agriculture, and governance, often with a firm hand. This long period of colonial oversight created a complex society, with layers of Dutch influence mixed with ancient local traditions. The early 20th century saw the rise of nationalist movements across Asia. In Indonesia, educated individuals began to organize and voice their desire for self-determination. They were inspired by similar movements in other colonized nations. The Dutch authorities often suppressed these movements, fearing the loss of their valuable colony. However, the spirit of nationalism could not be easily extinguished. It continued to simmer beneath the surface of colonial society. These early nationalists laid the groundwork for future struggles, building networks and articulating a vision for an independent Indonesia. Their efforts, though often met with severe repression, were crucial in fostering a collective Indonesian identity. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Japan was growing as a major military and industrial power. Japan had ambitions to create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This was their idea of an Asia free from Western colonial powers, but under Japanese leadership. To achieve this, Japan needed resources, especially oil and rubber, which Indonesia had in abundance. The Japanese government began to plan for expansion into Southeast Asia. This expansion was seen as essential for Japan's survival, and its goal to become the dominant power in Asia. The rhetoric used by Japan often emphasized liberating Asian nations from Western imperialism, an idea that initially found some appeal. As World War II began in Europe, the Netherlands was invaded and occupied by Germany in 1940. This event significantly weakened Dutch control over the East Indies. The colonial administration in Indonesia was now isolated from its home country. This created a power vacuum and an opportunity for other nations with interests in the region. Japan saw this as the perfect moment to advance its own plans. The vulnerability of the European colonial empires, exposed by the war in Europe, set the stage for a dramatic shift in power across Southeast Asia. The impending conflict would soon bring profound changes to the Indonesian archipelago. In early 1942, Japan launched its military campaign to seize Southeast Asia. The Japanese forces were well-trained and highly motivated. They moved with surprising speed and efficiency. The invasion of Indonesia began in January 1942, targeting key oil-producing areas like Tarakan and Balikpapan in Borneo. The Japanese military planners had meticulously studied the region, anticipating the Dutch defenses and exploiting their weaknesses. Their initial assaults were characterized by coordinated air and sea attacks, quickly overwhelming the local garrisons. This swiftness was a hallmark of Japan's early successes in the Pacific War. The Allied forces in the region, primarily Dutch, British, Australian, and American troops, were unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the Japanese attack. The Dutch colonial army, known as the NIL, fought back, but was ultimately no match for the invaders. Naval battles like the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942 resulted in decisive Japanese victories. These defeats shattered Allied naval power in the region, leaving the islands vulnerable to further Japanese advances. The speed of the Japanese conquest sent shockwaves through the Allied command and the colonial administrations. Within a few short months, the entire Indonesian archipelago fell under Japanese control. On March 8, 1942, the Dutch forces in Java officially surrendered. This marked the end of over 300 years of Dutch colonial presence, albeit temporarily. For many Indonesians, the rapid collapse of their seemingly powerful Dutch rulers was astonishing. Some initially viewed the Japanese as liberators, freeing them from European oppression. This perception was actively encouraged by Japanese propaganda, which presented Japan as the leader of Asia, fighting for Asia for the Asiatics. The sight of Asian soldiers defeating a European colonial power was a powerful symbol for many. The Japanese military quickly established its authority across the vast archipelago. They implemented martial law and began the process of dismantling the Dutch colonial administrative structures. The initial phase of the occupation was focused on securing strategic resources and establishing a firm grip on the population. The Japanese forces were initially welcomed by some segments of the Indonesian population who hoped for genuine independence. However, the nature of the Japanese occupation would soon reveal itself to be a new form of foreign domination, in many ways harsher than what preceded it. The initial period of uncertainty and cautious optimism would gradually give way to a more somber reality. Once control was established, Japan divided Indonesia into 3 separate military administration zones. Sumatra was placed under the command of the 25th Army, headquartered in Singapore. Java and Madura were governed by the 16th Army, based in Jakarta, which was then renamed from Batavia. The eastern islands, including Borneo, Sulawesi, the Moluccas, and Lesser Sunda Islands, were administered by the Imperial Japanese Navy. This division reflected Japan's strategic priorities, particularly the economic importance of Java and Sumatra, and the naval significance of the eastern archipelago. Each zone operated with a degree of autonomy, leading to variations in policy and its implementation across the islands. The Japanese military administrators replaced Dutch officials with Japanese personnel. However, they often retained Indonesian civil servants in lower and middle-ranking positions. This was partly due to a shortage of Japanese administrators and partly a strategy to gain local cooperation. Prominent Indonesian nationalist figures such as Sukarno and Hatta were released from Dutch imprisonment or exile. The Japanese sought to use their influence to rally popular support for the occupation and Japan's war effort. These nationalist leaders faced a difficult choice: cooperate with the Japanese in the hope of achieving independence later, or resist and risk severe repercussions for themselves and their people. Propaganda played a crucial role in the Japanese administration. They promoted the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere and the idea of Asia for the Asiatics. Japanese language and culture were promoted, while the use of Dutch was banned. The Gregorian calendar was replaced with the Japanese imperial calendar. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, and films were all used to disseminate Japanese views and encourage support for their war. They also established neighborhood associations, known as tonarigumi, to monitor and control the population at the grassroots level. These associations were an effective tool for surveillance and ensuring compliance with Japanese directives. Despite the propaganda, the Japanese administration was fundamentally a military occupation. The Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, became notorious for its brutality and ruthlessness. Arbitrary arrests, torture, and executions were common methods used to suppress dissent and maintain order. Fear became a pervasive element of life under Japanese rule. While some Indonesians initially hoped for liberation, the harsh realities of the occupation soon became apparent. The promise of a new era of Asian brotherhood quickly faded as the occupiers' demands and methods grew increasingly oppressive, replacing one form of colonial control with another, often more severe. Daily life for ordinary Indonesians changed dramatically under Japanese occupation. The economy, already strained by the war, suffered greatly. Essential goods like food, clothing, and medicine became scarce and expensive. The Japanese military confiscated resources for their war effort, leading to widespread shortages. Rationing systems were implemented, but they were often insufficient to meet basic needs. Many people experienced hunger and malnutrition. The disruption to inter-island trade, which was vital for the archipelago's economy, further exacerbated these problems. Families struggled to find enough food, and the general health of the population declined significantly. The Japanese implemented policies aimed at cultural assimilation. The Japanese language, Nippongo, was taught in schools, and students were required to participate in Japanese drills and ceremonies, including bowing towards Tokyo. The Indonesian language, Bahasa Indonesia, was surprisingly promoted as the administrative and national language, partly to eradicate Dutch influence, and partly because it was easier to disseminate propaganda in a language understood by more people. This promotion of Bahasa Indonesia, ironically, had a positive long-term effect on national unity. However, the imposition of Japanese customs and the suppression of Western cultural influences were often met with quiet resentment. Forced labor was one of the most brutal aspects of the Japanese occupation. Millions of Indonesian men, known as Romusha, were conscripted to work on Japanese military construction projects. These projects included building airfields, roads, railways, and fortifications, often in harsh and remote locations. The Romusha were subjected to terrible working conditions, with little food, no medical care, and brutal treatment from their Japanese overseers. Many thousands died from exhaustion, disease, and abuse. The Romusha system left deep scars on Indonesian society and became a potent symbol of Japanese cruelty and exploitation during the war. Fear and uncertainty pervaded everyday existence. The Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, instilled terror with their arbitrary arrests and brutal methods of interrogation. Informers were common, and people were afraid to speak openly against the occupiers. Public gatherings were strictly controlled, and any sign of dissent was harshly punished. Despite these oppressive conditions, Indonesians found ways to cope and resist in small ways. They relied on community solidarity, shared scarce resources, and maintained their cultural traditions as best they could. The period was a testament to human resilience in the face of extreme adversity and constant threat. Section 5. Economic Drain: Indonesia's Resources for Japan's War. The primary economic objective of the Japanese occupation was to exploit Indonesia's vast natural resources for Japan's war machine. Indonesia was rich in oil, rubber, tin, bauxite, and other raw materials essential for military industries. Upon arrival, the Japanese military immediately seized control of plantations, mines, and oil fields previously operated by the Dutch and other Western companies. They prioritized the production and shipment of these strategic materials back to Japan, or to support Japanese military operations throughout Southeast Asia. This systematic exploitation had a devastating impact on the local Indonesian economy, which was reconfigured to serve Japan's needs. Local industries that did not directly contribute to the Japanese war effort were neglected or shut down. This led to widespread unemployment and economic dislocation. Traditional agricultural practices were also disrupted. Farmers were often forced to cultivate crops deemed essential by the Japanese, such as cotton or castor beans for oil, instead of food crops like rice. This policy, combined with the confiscation of rice harvests to feed Japanese troops, led to severe food shortages and famine in several regions. The focus on resource extraction meant that investment in local infrastructure or welfare was minimal, further impoverishing the population. The Japanese introduced their own currency, often referred to as banana money, due to the images of banana trees on some notes. This currency was not backed by gold or any stable assets and was printed in large quantities, leading to hyperinflation. The value of the occupation currency plummeted, wiping out savings and making everyday goods unaffordable for most Indonesians. Bartering became common as people lost faith in the official currency. The economic chaos created immense hardship, pushing many families into destitution. This financial instability further compounded the suffering caused by resource shortages and forced labor. The transportation system, including railways and shipping, was commandeered by the Japanese military. This severely restricted the movement of goods and people for civilian purposes. Inter-island trade, which was crucial for the distribution of food and other necessities across the archipelago, collapsed. This isolation of different regions worsened local shortages and made it difficult for communities to support each other. The overall impact was a sharp decline in living standards and a regression of the Indonesian economy. The wealth of the islands was siphoned off, leaving the local population to bear the brunt of wartime deprivation and economic ruin. Section 6. Militarization and mobilization: Indonesians in Japanese uniform. A significant aspect of Japanese rule was the militarization of Indonesian society. The Japanese sought to mobilize the Indonesian population, particularly the youth, to support their war effort and to instill a martial spirit. They established various auxiliary military and paramilitary organizations. One of the most notable was PITA, Pembela Tanah Air, or Defenders of the Homeland, an Indonesian volunteer army formed in 1943. PITA was officered by Indonesians, but ultimately under Japanese command. The Japanese intended PITA to assist in defending Indonesia against a potential Allied invasion. Besides PITA, other groups were formed, such as the Heiho, who were Indonesian soldiers directly incorporated into the Japanese Imperial Army units as auxiliaries. There were also youth organizations like the Senandan, Youth Corps, and Keboden, Vigilance Corps, which provided basic military training and were used for local defense and public order tasks. These organizations involved hundreds of thousands of young Indonesians. While the Japanese aim was to create a compliant support base, the military training and organizational experience gained by these Indonesians would later prove invaluable in the fight for their own country's independence. The training provided in these organizations was often rigorous and harsh, emphasizing discipline, physical fitness, and loyalty to the Japanese cause. Indoctrination was a key component. with participants taught Japanese military values and anti-Western propaganda. However, for many Indonesian recruits, joining these organizations was not solely about supporting Japan. Some saw it as an opportunity to acquire military skills and knowledge that could one day be used to achieve genuine Indonesian independence. The experience also fostered a sense of national consciousness and camaraderie among young men from different parts of the archipelago. The Japanese also attempted to mobilize women through organizations like the Fujinkai, women's associations. These groups were typically involved in activities such as promoting public health, increasing food production, and supporting the war effort through various home front activities. While seemingly benign, these organizations also served as a means of extending Japanese control and influence into the domestic sphere. The widespread mobilization efforts, though intended to serve Japanese interests, inadvertently contributed to the development of a more organized and politically aware Indonesian populace, laying some groundwork for future self-governance. Section 7. Whispers of Resistance, Courage Against the Occupiers. Despite the risks and the brutality of the Japanese Kempeitai, resistance movements did emerge in various parts of Indonesia. These movements ranged from small, localized acts of defiance to more organized underground networks. Resistance took many forms, including armed struggle, intelligence gathering for the Allies, sabotage, and the secret dissemination of anti-Japanese information. Early resistance efforts were often spontaneous and quickly suppressed by the well-equipped Japanese forces. However, the spirit of opposition remained alive, fueled by the harshness of the occupation and the enduring desire for freedom. One notable armed uprising occurred in Blitar, East Java, in February 1945, led by PITA officer Supriyadi. This rebellion, though ultimately unsuccessful and brutally crushed by the Japanese, demonstrated that even within the Japanese-trained military units, nationalist sentiments were strong. Other armed resistance groups operated in regions like Aceh in Sumatra and in parts of Kalimantan and Sulawesi. These groups often consisted of former KNIL soldiers, local warriors, or disaffected civilians who took to the hills and jungles to wage guerrilla warfare against the occupiers. Their actions, while not always strategically decisive, kept the flame of resistance burning. Intellectual and political resistance also played a crucial role. Figures like Sultan Syahrir and Amir Sharifuddin led underground movements that focused on maintaining contact with Allied forces, organizing covert networks, and preparing for eventual independence. They worked secretly, often at great personal risk, to counter Japanese propaganda and to foster a sense of national unity among Indonesians. These leaders believed that cooperation with the Japanese, as practiced by Sukarno and Hatta, was a dangerous path, and they advocated for a more independent stance. Their efforts were vital in preserving an alternative vision for Indonesia's future. The resistance movements, though often fragmented and facing overwhelming odds, highlighted the deep-seated opposition to Japanese rule. They also underscored the complex political landscape, with different Indonesian leaders and groups adopting varying strategies in response to the occupation. Some chose overt cooperation, hoping to gain concessions from the Japanese, while others opted for clandestine resistance. The courage and sacrifice of those who resisted, whether through armed struggle or intellectual opposition, contributed significantly to the eventual Indonesian struggle for independence. Their actions demonstrated that the desire for self-rule could not be extinguished by foreign domination. Section 8. The Shifting Tides, Promises of Independence. As World War II progressed, Japan's military fortunes began to decline significantly by 1944. The Allied forces, led by the United States, were steadily advancing across the Pacific, retaking islands and inflicting heavy losses on the Japanese military. Faced with a deteriorating war situation and the increasing likelihood of an Allied invasion of Indonesia, the Japanese government began to change its stance towards Indonesian independence. In September 1944, Prime Minister Koiso Kuniaki officially promised that Indonesia would be granted independence in the near future. This promise was a strategic move aimed at securing Indonesian cooperation in the final stages of the war. Following this promise, the Japanese authorities took steps to prepare Indonesia for self-government, at least nominally. They allowed the Indonesian red and white flag to be flown alongside the Japanese flag and the Indonesian national anthem, Indonesia Raya, to be sung. A committee to prepare for Indonesian independence, the BPUPK, Badan Penyelidik Usaha-Usaha Persiapan Kemerdekaan, or Investigating Committee for Preparatory Work for Independence, was established in March 1945. This committee, chaired by Dr. Rajaman Wediodiningrat, included prominent nationalist leaders like Sukarno and Hatta. It was tasked with drafting a constitution for a future independent Indonesian state. The BPUPK held several important meetings during which key principles of the future Indonesian state were debated and formulated. It was during these discussions that Sukarno famously articulated his Pancasila philosophy, the 5 principles that would become the ideological foundation of independent Indonesia. These principles included belief in one God, humanitarianism, national unity, democracy, and social justice. The work of the BPUPK, although conducted under Japanese oversight, represented a crucial step in the formalization of Indonesian nationalist aspirations and the development of a framework for self-rule. It brought together diverse political voices to forge a common vision. In August 1945, as Japan faced imminent defeat, the preparations for Indonesian independence were accelerated. A new committee, the PPKI, Panitia Persiapan Kemerdekaan Indonesia, or Preparatory Committee for Indonesian Independence, was formed to finalize the plans. Sukarno and Hatta were flown to Dalat, Vietnam, to meet with Marshal Terauchi Hisaichi, the commander of the Japanese Southern Expeditionary Army Group, who confirmed that Japan would grant independence. However, events on the world stage were moving even faster. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August 1945 forced Japan's unconditional surrender, creating a sudden power vacuum in Indonesia. Section 9. Conclusion. The enduring legacy of a brief but pivotal era. The Japanese occupation of Indonesia, lasting from 1942 to 1945, was a relatively short period, but one that had profound and lasting consequences. The surrender of Japan on August 15, 1945, created an immediate power vacuum. Seizing this opportunity, Indonesian nationalist leaders Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta proclaimed Indonesia's independence on August 17, 1945, just 2 days after the Japanese surrender. This bold declaration marked the birth of the Republic of Indonesia. The Japanese occupation, by dismantling Dutch colonial rule and inadvertently fostering Indonesian military and political organization, had unintentionally paved the way for this momentous event. The experience of the occupation had a significant impact on Indonesian nationalism. The harshness of Japanese rule, including forced labor and economic exploitation, dispelled any initial illusions of liberation and strengthened the desire for genuine self-determination. The Japanese promotion of Bahasa Indonesia as a unifying language and the military training provided to Indonesians through organizations like PT equipped them with tools and skills that proved crucial in the subsequent struggle against the returning Dutch. The shared suffering under Japanese rule also helped to forge a stronger sense of common Indonesian identity across the diverse archipelago. Economically, the Japanese occupation left Indonesia in a devastated state. Resources had been plundered, infrastructure was damaged, and hyperinflation had crippled the economy. The post-war Indonesian government faced the immense task of rebuilding the nation, while simultaneously fighting a war of independence against the Dutch, who sought to re-establish their colonial control. The social fabric had also been strained by the hardships of the occupation, including widespread famine and disease. The memory of the Romusha and other atrocities committed during this period left deep psychological scars on the population. In the long term, the Japanese occupation fundamentally altered Indonesia's trajectory. It shattered the myth of European invincibility and demonstrated that Asian peoples could govern themselves. It provided Indonesian nationalists with valuable administrative and military experience. While the occupation was a period of immense suffering, it also acted as a catalyst for the Indonesian Revolution and the eventual achievement of full sovereignty. The events of 1942 to 1945 remain a critical and complex chapter in Indonesian history, shaping its path to becoming the nation it is today, a period of hardship that ultimately fueled the unyielding quest for freedom.